Okay, we've got about a minute to go before we really get underway, but I am glad that you are here joining us for this live stream announcing the book being launched. So we'll just kind of hang out here for a minute and all right, so we're going to get started in just a minute. Hope everyone is having a fantastic start to the week. It's been a real busy week, but thankfully I got to see a couple of games with my Durham Bulls, and they pulled out 5 wins out of 6 games against the Charlotte Knights. So that's always a good week for me. So it was a good start. All right. Well, I am going to go ahead and get started because it's 6 o'clock. I said we're going to get started at 6 o'clock, and that's exactly what we're going to do. The book is finally done. Put a lot of work into this one. It's called the Divorce Firewall Strategy. And it really kind of came about the way a lot of my other books and the places that I practice, the areas I practice law in came about. It's because of some experiences that I ended up having and started trying to figure out how could things have run more smoothly. That's just the way it's been since I got started. Many of you probably already know the story of how I ended up getting involved in estate planning and making revocable living trusts a way to avoid probate, a big part of what I do in my estate planning practice. And that's because my grandmother ended up having a lot of difficulty with my grandfather's estate. And so she was calling me and asking me questions, even though I was still in law school, and I'm trying to find answers to her questions. But at the same time, I'm trying to figure out how can I work with my clients to help prevent all of this stuff so that this mess doesn't happen to my clients. And ended up reading a really good book called The Living Trust by Henry W. Apps III. And that kind of got me on that path, using revocable trust and estate planning as a way to avoid probate and make things much smoother for the family after my clients pass on. So it was really because of my grandmother that I did that. Another area of law that I got into was Medicaid planning. I am actually a certified Medicaid planner, and I'm helping families rearrange their assets in a way to make sure that they can keep as much as the law allows and not spend any more than they have to before care kicks in through the Medicaid program when it comes to things like nursing home care. All right, great. So that's that area of law. But why divorce? Jeff, are you getting into divorce law? No. God, no. Oh my gosh. I tried a couple of divorce cases that looked real easy, really early on, trying to figure out, is this something I want to do? And that is a definite no. Now, throughout my entire practice, I have been able to help people do premarital agreements, but that's really only a part of planning to help avoid those big pitfalls and areas of divorce that could really end up having people lose an awful lot of what they've built up over their lives. So the Divorce Firewall Strategy, the subheading is how to avoid losing everything in a divorce by planning ahead. And that's really the key to it. This one gentleman I remember many years ago, this was before I even got into my current office. So this was, more than 20 years ago. He came to me, he wanted to do planning. It's like, I finally paid off my mortgage. I want to make sure that I'm putting together a plan the right way so that it avoids probate. He had seen my website and looked at, this is something that I'm interested in. So we started going through his assets. And I'm like, okay, he gave me the deed. And I'm like, well, wait, who's so-and-so? Oh, that's my ex-wife. Your ex-wife. When did you divorce? It's like, well, okay, we ended up buying the house. I don't know what it was. It was just the stress of moving and changing things up. Like 4 months later, she took off and kind of that was the end of it. We ended up getting divorced. I'm like, well, did your attorney handle the divorce? He's like, oh, I didn't need an attorney for that. I went down to the courthouse and got the fill-in forms, and that's what we did. The problem is those fill-in forms gave you what's called an absolute divorce. And it just means you're no longer married. That's it. You're no longer married, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the assets. So he had this house. He had paid it off, but his ex-wife was still on the deed. And I had to tell him, look, half this house actually belongs to her. That's ridiculous. I've been paying the mortgage myself all this time. And it's like, well, okay. I know you don't like what I'm telling you, but you're going to have to find some way to get her off the deed. And that's beyond what I end up doing. He was not happy with that answer at all. But the fact is, he now has to go to his ex-wife, whom he had divorced like 15 years earlier, and say, hey, I had paid off the mortgage. You're half on this house. I need you to sign over that you don't want any piece of it. I never found out how that ended up going, because I think he just was embarrassed and didn't want to come back. And sometimes that happens. But then another issue was a friend of mine. He went through a divorce, and thankfully he didn't end up with an awful lot of issues on that. And it was, I don't want to say it was amicable. He was very upset with it. But she ended up with a big inheritance that he wasn't privy to or able to have any part of. And that made everything else, the division, kind of come right down the middle, and it was fine. And as in terms of child custody and all that other stuff, that was just split down the middle, because they were just old enough that they could have picked. And anything other than really a 50-50, give or take a day or two here or there or whatever, just be flexible about it, that just would have ended up being more of a disaster than it was really worth. So, okay, fantastic. That worked out okay, but the wheels start turning. The other thing that really started this with me was after the lockdowns were ending, I had a lot of my clients come to me and say, I'm starting to see my kids having problems with their marriage, and I think it might be headed for divorce. What do I need to do to plan to make sure that my assets don't end up somehow or another, who dies in what order? I absolutely don't want a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law to end up getting my stuff. I want it to absolutely go to the grandkids. All right, well, that's planning for the next generation. And I wanted to know, how can people protect themselves with their wealth and with their assets? So what I'm going to do, I prepared something a little bit different than what I usually do. We've got some pictures and stock footage, but I read the introduction. And so I'm going to go ahead and switch over to that.
Introduction. The stories emerge every day. A couple meets, dates, and he falls hard for her. He does all the romantic things he was always told to by bringing her flowers, taking her on expensive dates, and they move in together. Eventually, in 2008, he gets down on one knee in front of their family and friends, surrounded by rose petals at sunset on the beach, and he proposes in an Instagram-worthy fashion, if Instagram would have been a thing back then. This is the fictional story of Bill Peterson. 15 years later, it is 2023, and Bill is now a 45-year-old financial advisor who lost big in a divorce with his wife, Karen. Bill was raised by his single mom with a largely absent father, and he was always taught to revere women, put them on a pedestal, and to become the Prince Charming that will one day find his princess. That princess was Karen. She was, quote, the one that his mother, grandmother, aunts, and other women in his life always told him to be on the lookout for. But how did Bill get here? When he was growing up, Bill went about doing everything that the women in his life told him to do. He went to college, majored in economics, but then went to get an MBA and became a financial advisor. Bill always treated women with perfect respect, always deferring to what she wanted, just like he did with the adult women in his life who raised him. He landed a good job with a medium sized firm, earning a good salary, and that's when he met Karen. She was everything he ever wanted. He fawned over her, bought her expensive presents, and when she started hinting at marriage, he did the beachside proposal because that's what men are expected to do. Of course, Bill sought his mother's approval first, and she readily approved. Karen was his princess, and they would live happily ever after. Or so he thought. Bill and Karen were married when both were age 30, and there was no mention of those silly prenuptial agreements and protections in Bill's world. They were in love. They were looking forward to their happily ever after, and that was going to be enough. Over time, Bill and Karen had 3 children, and Karen stayed at home with no thoughts of going back to work after giving birth to their firstborn. Despite their agreement, she would continue to work. Bill would never hint at asking Karen to do something she didn't want to do, so he just worked extra hours to make up the financial difference while his career progressed. According to Karen, this decision was eventually vindicated when Bill became a partner with his firm, and the money started flowing in. Bill and Karen bought their dream home and dream cars, sent their kids to private school, and with money inherited from his grandfather, Bill and Karen brought their vacation home at the beach. Happily ever after was progressing nicely. Unfortunately, 15 years after being married, Karen became bored once the kids became independent enough to get themselves up and ready for school, and so Karen started having an affair with her youngest son's soccer coach, Kyle. Bill put up with a lot from Karen because, happy wife, happy life. But now poor Bill is divorced from Karen because the infidelity was a bridge too far, even though his own mother pleaded with him to forgive Karen. And his mother did so despite the fact that Karen was still screwing Kyle behind Bill's back. "You just need to try harder to win her back, dear," his mother told him. In the divorce, here's what Bill lost, even though Karen is the one who cheated on Bill because it was a no-fault divorce state. He lost the house in its entirety. He lost half the vacation home that was paid for with Grandpa's money because at the time he purchased it, he titled Karen's name jointly on the deed with him. He lost half of the investments he owned. He lost half of his 401k. Karen got the more expensive of the 2 cars. Bill pays alimony and child support, and Karen doesn't have to work until the youngest child turns 18, more than a decade away. In less than a year, Karen went from being Bill's princess to the evil witch bent on making his life miserable. She even had the nerve to move Kyle into the house Bill paid for. Meanwhile, Bill is now living in a 1-bedroom apartment with loud neighbors keeping him up at night, and he gets to see his kids every other weekend while hearing about all the horrible things that Mommy said about him and about all the great things Kyle did with them. Welcome to modern America. Unfortunately, this is something that happens all the time, and it's not just happening to men these days. It's happening to women who are the primary breadwinners in the family. But we'll get to that in a bit. It doesn't have to be this way. If you want to be the type of person, the type of man who's going to end up securing themselves in their future for themselves and their kids, even at the expense of a wayward spouse who's going to try to take advantage of you when things turn bad, then we need to learn from poor Bill's mistakes and take a look at how things should be done instead. We need to know how to set up a divorce firewall between your future spouse and your hard-earned wealth. Now, here's the story of Rob Paulson. Rob was raised by a single father whose mother was not in the picture. His single father, Dan, taught him all of the lessons he learned after seeing what his mother did to his father in a divorce. Dan intentionally raised Rob to have an independent streak, ambitious habits, and a strong work ethic. Rob learned many lessons from his father on the way men interact with others, not just women. He was always skeptical, especially of women who batted their eyelashes at him, and while he learned to appreciate the good things in life, he was never going to expect some princess to fall into his lap because she was, quote, the one. Relationships are hard work, his father taught him. People can change over time, and when they do, you may be the one losing out. So appreciate those good times, but always protect yourself before any bad times come. Just like poor Bill Peterson from the first story, Rob attended college where he majored in economics, went on to graduate school to get his MBA, and then became a financial advisor. Rob was working on his career and life, and women were just an occasional distraction for him. He valued and respected women for who and what they were, but Rob would never put a woman on a pedestal, and he never tolerated disrespect. Rob landed a good job with a medium-sized firm, earning a good salary early in his career, but eventually he started his own firm once he learned how to really make money at the financial advising game. Rob was already set up with the protective trust as well as a series of corporate entities owning his major assets, such as real estate and cars. That's when Rob met Stacy. He was in his early 30s and she was in her late 20s. Stacy was loyal, agreeable, and always made Rob feel like he was the most important man in the world. After a year, Stacy and Rob signed a cohabitation agreement and moved into one of the properties Rob owned through an LLC titled in the name of his trust. They also both signed a month-to-month lease and equally paid cash. Within a year, Stacy started talking about marriage, and that's when they had the talk about a premarital agreement. After talking to her mother, Stacy said she wasn't fond of the idea, giving the usual arguments about how prenups were like expecting the marriage to fail. However, Rob flipped that argument on its head, telling her that if the marriage was going to succeed anyway, then there would be no harm in creating and maintaining a premarital agreement. And if she didn't like it, then they could simply not get married and continue on the way they were or call it quits. It was her choice. Stacy changed her tune and they both went to their attorneys to hammer out the details. Rob was married to his wife when he was 35 and she was 30. They had 3 children, and 15 years later, Stacy cheated on Rob with a coworker. The situation is sounding a little familiar, isn't it? But fortunately for Rob, this story has a much better ending for him and for his kids. Here's what happened to Rob in the divorce. Rob kept the house since it was purchased by his trust. Stacy wasn't on the deed, and in fact, Rob didn't even own the house directly for it to even be considered in a divorce. Rob kept the vacation house that was purchased with inherited money because he put the money into his trust, and the trustee purchased the vacation home through a newly created LLC, and it even generated some rental income from time to time for the trust. Rob kept all of his investments since the excess money from his paycheck and distributions from his firm also went into the trust to purchase those investments. Rob kept all of his vehicles because all of them were owned through the corporate entities in the trust. Rob kept his retirement and Stacy kept hers because that's what was in the premarital agreement. Rob pays no alimony because that was also in the premarital agreement, and because Stacy agreed to not stop working, nor did she, and had her own income to support herself. Rob is paying some child support because he earns much more than his now ex-wife does, but he always knew that he would. Rob and Stacy have equal joint custody because that is also what they agreed to in the premarital agreement, and the judge found no reason to alter that. Rob is living a good life. He sees and raises his children half the time, and the other half of the time he is working hard on his business or pursuing his own hobbies with a few casual female friends on the side. This can also be modern America. That is, if you're smart enough to deny the fantasies of finding, quote, the one, and simply finding someone who is suited to be your spouse. You can still take all of the right legal precautions to make sure you do not get devastated in the event of a divorce while working to make sure that your marriage is not on the wrong side of the statistics. You can have a firewall strategy just like Rob did. Getting divorced is a very common story among men. They hear it all the time from friends and family members, and they see the devastation that's wrought on them. This is despite the fact that everyone is always encouraged to marry for love and they maintain this fantasy until the fantasy comes crashing down. But if you can keep your head about you, then you can prepare appropriately. And as we are in the 2020s and will soon be in the 2030s, we are seeing a lot more of an equalization of education and salaries among men and women. We are seeing a lot of women becoming the breadwinners in the family. More and more men are the ones giving up their jobs and staying at home to raise the children. And now, when there's a divorce, we're starting to see the women being the ones paying alimony and child support and losing half of their house and half of their investments. And they do not like this at all, nor should they. This isn't a men versus women issue, nor a spouse versus spouse issue. It's an issue of protecting yourself as best you can in this world because no one else is going to do it for you. If you're going to get married, then you need to make sure you're defending yourself appropriately in case things turn bad. This doesn't mean you are, quote, dooming the marriage before it starts by getting your ducks in a row, preparing legal paperwork, and executing legal agreements. That's crazy. In divorce, you don't end up losing someone else's love and affection in a legal judgment. You don't end up losing the feeling of a partner's acceptance and love by virtue of a court order. You end up losing that anyway because the relationship is over. The court is all about finances and property. So if you want to legally protect yourself and your finances and your property, then you need some legally protective documents and to employ the right techniques. Be a lot more like Rob or you'll end up like Bill. This book can show you how.
Okay, so I hope you found that kind of entertaining. That's the introduction read for the book, The Divorce Firewall Strategy, which, of course, is available on Amazon right now at divorcefirewall.com. And it really is, it's a way to have just extra protection. Now, the good thing about this is if you look at this strategy and you go through these components, there's also an awful lot of lawsuit protection, creditor protection, and disability and other benefit protection for you if it's done the right way. So let me just give you an overview of really the four big areas, the four big document types that make up a lot of this strategy. The first one is the new one. It's a domestic asset protection trust. Now, this is not available in every state, but you can kind of have your trust come under the jurisdiction of a specific state if you take these specific steps to do so. I talk about that a little bit more in the book, but basically you have minimum things under state law. And the one we're typically looking at is Wyoming. Under Wyoming state law, that brings the trust and the assets under its jurisdiction, and therefore you can use that type of trust and have that protection. So that domestic asset protection trust is a trust you set up. You are the beneficiary, but you are not a trustee that can give yourself money or allow you to use property inside that trust. There has to be another trustee. So this is really a trusted person, a friend, relative, obviously not a spouse, not a child, siblings. All right, maybe your cousin or your best friend. And there are ways to have corporate trustees in there as well, but they are the ones that we call the benefit trustee. They're the ones who say whether or not you can get stuff. Now, there's also an administrative trustee that handles things specifically required under that state's jurisdiction. Now, for Wyoming, it's simply that there has to be some assets in there. I mean, you could open up a credit union account in a branch in Wyoming. There has to be either a person who resides in Wyoming or a bank or trust company that is allowed to conduct business in Wyoming and falls under those Wyoming statutes. Okay. And this administrative trustee has to keep the copy of the records in the trust, and they're the party responsible for making sure that the taxes are done each year. Okay, that's not really a lot. Now, the good thing about this particular type of trust is if it's your trust, you can actually be the investment advisor and you can handle all of the investments. So you can't give yourself money, but you can be that investment advisor, and you can make sure that you're handling the assets the way you want to. Even if one of those assets is a corporation or an LLC that you're running for your business, you can be the manager of the LLC. You can run it as either an employee or as the CEO, but your benefits trustee is the one who's technically owning it on behalf of the trust. So again, there's a lot more about that in the actual book. Second big thing, and it's kind of almost the same thing, but 2 and 3, there's a cohabitation agreement if you're going to end up living with someone who's a romantic partner, but you're not intending to be married at that point. So that's just one way to not have like quote common law marriage. You're going to have a cohabitation agreement specifically stating you're living together, but you're not intending to be married or considered married. And you keep your property separate, and here's who's responsible for what, and here's how bills and things are handled. And this should be in place if you're going to be moving in with someone, and there's some strategies to make sure it doesn't become a disaster. I've heard way too many stories of people who are, they end up cohabitating, and then one of them leaves, and then they can't afford the apartment on their own, the person who's left. So, all right. There's also then the premarital agreement, which ends up being a keystone to the whole thing because it also coordinates and says, here, I have this trust. So I have this domestic asset protection trust, and that's considered separate property. And you keep putting your assets into that trust, whatever you're not really paying towards the mutual bills in the course of a marriage. So you can lay out between the two of you, here's how we're going to pay for things. Here's how we're going to handle things. And there's a couple of big things in there. You got to make sure nobody's ever asked not to work. You're both going to keep contributing, and you're laying out, here's what happens with things like alimony and child support and whatnot. So in that sense, it's almost this good standard premarital agreement that attorneys use, and you each have your own attorney. And then the third thing, the last thing is using corporate structures in this. So if you're going to have rental property as an investment, you're going to have that inside an LLC or a corporation, and your trust will own the LLC or the corporation. So that's going to give you a little bit of extra protection. And now here's a little something that I mention in the book as a potential strategy. And look, as long as state law says it's okay and everybody's above board with it, okay. If you and your spouse are going to equally contribute to the rent, and the house that you're renting is a property that you own through an LLC, which is in your domestic asset protection trust, well, then you've got your money going in, but also your spouse's money going in. That's income for your trust. So you're actually getting some money from your spouse as renters inside this house. Now, obviously, you can negotiate these terms with your very trusted trustee, and they can have a lower cost, so it's a little bit easier to lift. But the point is that money's going in. Now, all right, what happens if there isn't a divorce? Well, presumably, everything's going to end up going to the kids anyway. That's what most of my clients want. Eventually, even when they're married, eventually they expect everything to go down to the next generation if they include the spouse or not. Now, I also do put into the book that there are some ways, if everything ends up working out with the spouse and you want to take care of them, you don't adjust the trust or necessarily give assets directly to the spouse through your estate plan. You can, part of this would be setting up a revocable living trust to handle the stuff that's outside your protected domestic asset protection trust and avoid probate and keep it out of the court system. You set up a life insurance policy to pay into the revocable trust, and the trust says, okay, this money is there for the spouse, provided you weren't divorced, and provided you weren't separate and living apart, and provided they don't remarry before the money comes out. And you can leave that in the hands of the trustee to make sure that your spouse is taken care of. You can set up $1 million policy, but that doesn't mean $1 million just has to dump into the spouse's pocket. You can structure it through a revocable trust to make sure that they are supported. And this is probably something that over time you're updating in the premarital agreements, every 3, 4, 5 years that you should be updating a premarital agreement. You can add those terms. It's just whatever works for the two of you. The second way is an IRA spousal trust. So this way you can set up so IRAs can go into an IRA trust that's going to support your spouse. And you can figure out the different terms and the taxes that go around it. But it's money that's there for the spouse, but it's still staying outside of the main plan with your domestic asset protection trust. So those are the big things. Don't want to take up too much time just because I do cover it in a lot more depth than I typically do for most of my books. Usually it's just giving you the high level view, just enough to understand here's what the strategy is and get the point across. I do go into detail, and I make a little more recurring use of the fictional characters than I usually do in this book. So there's Bill Peterson and Rob Paulson, and yes, they do cross paths a couple of times because they kind of went to the same school and they're seeing each other at different periods of time. And then there's also other characters in there that just to spice it up and keep it interesting, using stories as a way to convey that information. So what's coming next? Well, all right, we've got at divorcefirewall.com, there's going to be that link to the actual physical book that's for sale on Amazon now. In a couple of weeks, maybe as much as a month, we're going to have the Kindle edition, and that'll be another live stream, but this will probably be a little more brief, just to announce that the Kindle is ready and out and available. And it's very likely going to be at the same thing, divorcefirewall.com. But again, it'll be there in a bit. And then I'm hoping, fingers crossed, there's a lot going on, that by the time we get to around December, meaning Christmas time, holiday season 2023, that we'll actually have more of a full-blown course available where we go a lot more in depth and have some examples and maybe even samples of how this all works so that you can more fully understand it, because it does get to be more complicated. All right. So I hope you enjoyed that information. If it's not you, even if you know that there's someone in your life who could benefit from this, please check out the book over at Amazon. And as I always tell my clients, please stay safe, plan ahead, and enjoy life. And whatever you do, make it a great day. All right. That's going to be the video, but hey, I've got the chat up. If anybody has any questions about that, please go ahead and put it into the chat, and we'll see what questions come. We can do a Q&A. Now, I know that the live stream is just a little bit behind, so if you can, go ahead and put in any questions that you may have. We'll give it a few minutes and see. All right. Well, there will be more videos and more shorts coming out. This is going to end up being a topic of conversation that's going to end up keep going. Oh, looks. Thanks for sharing. Thank you, Multimedia Marketing Strategies. I appreciate it. We're going to have more shorts, and we're going to handle more components and some more videos on YouTube as we go through the next year or so with highlighting different parts of the book. So, okay. Well, thank you very much for attending, and please feel free to contact the office if you do have any questions. The office number is 919-844-7993. And make it a great day, a great week, and